You're listening to an ECGI podcast on corporate power and the politics of change with Matteo Gatti.
A few years ago, Citigroup announced it would no longer do business with gun retailers that skip background checks or sell to buyers under 21, effectively imposing rules stricter than under most state laws. Around the same time, Disney picked a very public fight with Florida Governor Ron DeSantis over the Don't Say Gay legislation and paid a serious price for it. Corporations, in other words, had decided they had something to do and say about politics. That is what my book is about. But something else has been happening simultaneously, and it runs in the opposite direction. When Paramount was competing to acquire Warner Bros. Discovery, its backers didn't just hire antitrust lawyers. They called the White House. They sent politically connected intermediaries. They made assurances about what would happen to CNN. Meanwhile, Palantir's CEO has spent the last year publicly embracing the current administration's agenda, and his company continues to expand its federal contracts. These are not corporations shaping politics. This is politics shaping corporations, rewarding loyalty, punishing dissent, manufacturing independence. My book asks what happens when corporations enter politics. My guest today asks what happens when politics enters corporations. Same terrain, opposite directions. And together we obtain a much more complete and alarming picture. I am Matteo Gatti. This is Corporate Power and the Politics of Change, an ECGI podcast. Stay with us. Welcome to Corporate Power and the Politics of Change, an ECGI podcast. I'm Matteo Gatti, professor of law at Rutgers Law School, research member of the European Corporate Governance Institute, and author of Corporate Power and the Politics of Change, published by Cambridge University Press. My book is about what I call corporate governing, the phenomenon by which corporations have stepped into contested socioeconomic spaces, making choices and taking positions that once belonged to governments. It is a book about corporations as political actors. Today's conversation is in a sense the mirror image of that. My guest has been asking the inverse question. What happens when it's the state that uses corporations and the levers of economic life to manufacture political loyalty? What happens when the direction of travel reverses, when it's not corporations shaping politics, but politicians using corporations to entrench themselves in power and expand their powers? Reilly Steel is an associate professor of law at Columbia Law School. He works at the intersection of corporate governance and political science. His most recent paper, Systematic Corruption, forthcoming in the Columbia Law Review, is a very timely and important piece of legal scholarship. And his empirical work on the political transformation of corporate America, published in the American Political Science Review, has reshaped how many of us, myself included, think about the ideological evolution of corporate elites. I cite his work throughout my book, and I'm genuinely delighted to have him here. Reilly, welcome to the podcast. It's really great to have you here.
Thanks so much, Matteo. Excited for this conversation today and to get into it.
Okay, Reilly, let's start with the diagnosis. Your paper draws a sharp distinction between two kinds of corruption, opportunistic and systematic. Walk us through that distinction.
Sure. So opportunistic corruption is the sort of more familiar type to most people today. This is about kind of the purchase and sale of public goods or public benefits for private gain. So think like the bag of cash in exchange for some legislative favor, or perhaps you're making policy while having some sort of concealed personal investment. The corruption prosecution is Bob Menendez or Eric Adams. Those are largely stories about opportunistic corruption. The type of corruption I focus on in the paper, systematic corruption, is something more, something that goes more fundamentally, I think, to the heart of both political and economic competition. This is about more than just private gain. It's about corruption of the system itself that occurs when politicians take some sort of economic privilege, whether that's a cash subsidy or sort of enforcement forbearance. There are many different forms it can take. And you take those economic privileges, you manipulate them to secure the political loyalty of the recipients of those privileges. The way it works is politicians who have some political power dole out some economic privileges conditionally on the anticipated or actual political support of those who receive the privileges. Those privileges create economic dependence. The economic dependence, in turn, incentivizes the recipients of the privilege to kind of kick back some political support to their patrons in government. And then that political support, in turn, entrenches the politicians in power. So it creates a kind of vicious cycle where you start with political power and you use that to dole out privileges. That creates dependence. The dependence, in turn, sort of feeds back through political support to entrench the political power in the first place. So you have economic and political power reinforcing each other. And oftentimes you have entrenchment both of the politicians and the economic actors who receive those privileges because they can get some rents from those privileges.
So you do a great job at framing all of this in an historical context because you give us several examples of systematic corruption, and you sort of also create parallels to what is happening right now in the current moment. Can you give our listeners an idea of how things shaped in the past and how things are looking right now?
Yeah, happy to do that. And I'll give a little background about how sort of the genesis of this project. I was teaching a seminar last fall at Columbia called Politics in the Corporation. And we went through the history of the corporation, starting in ancient Rome and going all the way through the early modern England, looking at the East India Company, and then into the early United States, looking at the early Republic, and reading about how corporate chartering worked back then. So today, if you want to charter a corporation, it's not all that complicated. For most types of corporations, you just file your paperwork with, let's say, the Delaware Secretary of State. You get your charter. For certain types of corporations like banks, it's a little more involved, but it's still pretty bureaucratized. Back in the early Republic, you had to go get a special statute passed just for you. So if you wanted to form a bank or a turnpike company, or whatever it may have been, you had to go to the state legislature in whatever state you were located in and lobby for some sort of special statute that gave you a corporate charter. So we read about this in the class, and we read about how this special incorporation regime was rife with corruption in many states and industries. So in New York State, for example, Van Buren, who you may know is later president of the United States, early on, he was a state politician in New York, first a state senator, and then later became United States senator for New York. And he ran the nation's first political machine called the Albany Regency, called by its critics the Regency. He didn't use that term. And the Albany Regency used various types of economic levers to entrench itself politically, including bank and insurance charters. He and his allies in the legislature would hand out these charters to allies and, in fact, appoint administrators for the initial share offerings who would give out shares to party supporters as a way to kind of bind his coalition to help support them in power. And he used public employment in the same way. So government jobs. This later became known as the spoils system, and it kind of started here in New York under the Albany Regency. So he used these different economic levers, whether it was corporate charters or government jobs, to help build up a loyal following that allowed them to have control over New York State politics for the better part of 2 decades. So that is, in short, sort of what it looked like historically. And in the paper, I cover some other contexts as well, including government contracts and public finance. There were even more examples that I don't even get to in the paper, like pushcart licenses in New York City. But in various domains of the 19th century, these economic privileges were handed out as a way to kind of build the political coalition and bind people to this particular group in power. And I could say it happens even outside of the United States to this day. In Russia, for example, under Putin, I think they use similar sorts of levers. But I focus on the United States in the paper. So that's what it looks like historically.
Okay, so you explain why you think the current moment is uniquely dangerous. From that era to today's era, what makes this different from previous episodes of political interference in corporate life?
Sure. I think it's happening in multiple contexts today. I will get into all of them, but one, I think, particularly prominent example, perhaps for your listeners, is merger review under the second Trump administration. I think the way the DOJ and FTC are conducting antitrust review of mergers and acquisitions has all the hallmarks of systematic corruption. So if you've been following the recent news about Paramount's acquisition of Warner Brothers Discovery, there was a bidding war between Netflix and Paramount, and it's been reported that as part of their efforts to secure approval and to try to get the administration back when Netflix was still in the running to kind of say no to the Netflix acquisition, the Ellisons and their other representatives of Paramount were providing assurances to the Trump administration that they would do the right thing, so to speak, with CNN, which is a Warner Brothers Discovery asset. And of course, CNN is a longtime object of criticism from President Trump. So I think the idea is, oh, well, they would change its editorial coverage to be more favorable to Trump and the administration. And this is very much analogous to some things that happened back during the 19th century when Congress awarded lucrative printing contracts for partisan newspapers as a way to kind of subsidize partisan journalism and get the media of that time, which was newspapers, on board with the dominant coalition. And I think this is kind of the 21st century version of that. So why do I think it's more dangerous today? The short answer being that the structural conditions that once constrained systematic corruption back in the day, essentially the kind of Madisonian system of checks and balances, are what they used to be. Why are they not what they used to be? Well, for one, there's a huge growth in presidential power, coupled with unitary executive theory, which concentrates power in one actor and, in fact, one person, the unitary executive. So that's, contrast that with the 19th century, the era that Woodrow Wilson famously called congressional government. Back then, power was more dispersed. Second, there's the erosion of interbranch rivalry. So again, back then, I think each institution, true to the way that Madison envisioned things, or at least more approaching the way that Madison envisioned things, acted on it on the basis of its sort of institutional ambition. Remember, there was conflict between Congress and the president more than there is today. Today, I think politics is organized less around a separation of powers than what Darrell Levinson and Richard Pildes call a separation of parties. So this means if the president's a Republican, members of Congress who are Republicans are unlikely to challenge him. Same goes, I think, when you have a Democratic president and Democratic members of Congress. So Congress is less of a check. Third thing I would point to is increased partisan sorting in the judiciary. So today, judicial ideology increasingly tracks the party of the appointing president. John Kostelik and Chuck Cameron have exhaustively cataloged and quantified this in their recent book on Supreme Court appointments. So this means the judiciary becomes less promising as an institution of countervailing power. And then the fourth thing I would point to is the concentration of authority over economic privileges being increasingly concentrated at the federal level, as opposed to more dispersed amongst the states and localities. And this basically makes systematic corruption more scalable. So you can kind of coordinate the discipline you're exercising rather than having to go state by state, locality by locality. Put all this stuff together, and I think power is more concentrated, it's more scalable. So the dangers are just heightened today compared to back.
Thank you. So you are drawing an historical parallel that is striking, and it's a little alarming, especially for the reason you just mentioned, and now the executive is much more powerful. You show, though, that our predecessors in the 19th century, the reformers, confronted something that was structurally similar. Again, you mentioned corporate charters dispense for political loyalty, public employment as a spoil system, government contract as patronage. And what they did was institutional redesign. And in your paper, you distill three guiding principles: constrain discretion, insulate for partisan control, and build, as you mentioned, countervailing power. Can you explain each to our listeners?
Sure. So as you noted, there are these three principles that I think are reflected in the reforms that we saw in the 19th and into the 20th century. The constraints on discretion, basic idea here is you tie the hands of those who are making these decisions about how to allocate economic privileges such that they can't make the decisions based on political favoritism. So one example would be the shift from special incorporation to general incorporation. You can think about that as constraining the discretion of those who are making these chartering decisions. They can't make it based on whatever the heck criteria they may be using back in the smoke-filled back rooms. Instead, there are some specified criteria. If you meet these criteria, you get your charter. And you can think about this as kind of emphasizing the rule of law, or perhaps rules over standards. Second principle, insulation from partisan control. Here, you're trying to achieve a similar purpose through a slightly different way. Here, you're shielding the decision makers from the partisan influences that might otherwise lead them to make these decisions based on partisan allegiances or loyalties. So rather than directly constraining the decision makers, you're changing their incentives. So you could still have discretion, but those who are making the decisions don't quite have the same partisan incentives they might otherwise have. An example would be independent agencies, where the heads of the agencies are not removable by politicians at will. If you can also subject them to professional norms, that can sort of perhaps override those partisan incentives. The third principle would be countervailing power. Here, the idea is you build up rival centers of authority that could contest systematic corruption. That could be through empowering interest groups. It could be by bringing citizens into the policymaking process through some sort of participatory governance. It could be by harnessing market competition. You can think about general incorporation as harnessing market competition insofar as there's interstate competition for corporate charters, which acts on a constraint on using corporate charters as spoils. If Delaware goes ahead and gives out charters or treats political allies more favorably than enemies, that could lead companies to flee Delaware for other jurisdictions. So markets can also act as a form of countervailing power. I'll just make one big picture point, which is these three principles are not prescriptions to be maximized in every single case. Oftentimes you see these reforms kind of emphasizing one principle over another. For example, you might loosen some constraints on discretion and substitute it with some countervailing power. But I think pretty much all the reforms that I've seen reflect a balance of these principles to some degree or another. So I think they provide a useful framework to think about how we might go about combating systematic corruption.
Great, thank you. So we have just spent some time talking about how the executive expanded so dramatically. So I wonder how much of this toolkit, these, for lack of a better term, 19th century toolkit, actually travel to this moment with this very concentration of power. Is this going to be harder to implement?
Yes, I think they travel to this moment. And yes, I think it's going to be harder to implement given the realities of the American political economy today. So, in terms of do I think it travels to this moment? Yes, these are universal principles. And in fact, you can find these principles reflected in political theory, normative political theory, going back centuries, if not millennia, all the way back to like Aristotle, Polybius, going a little forward to your home country, Machiavelli. Not The Prince, but Discourses on Livy. You can find it in Madison here across the Atlantic in the United States. It's very much, I cite Madison profusely in this project. And in fact, if you look even at the reforms that go into the 20th century, you see them reflected in those reforms as well. So I don't see this as something that's limited to a particular era or a particular country even. They're very much universal. But at the same time, I take your point. Yes, we've seen some serious erosions of the structural safeguards today, which is why I think today is a particularly dangerous moment, which makes things harder to fix. And that's part of the reason why the solutions I've discussed in part 3 of the paper don't boil down to, oh, let's just do the same thing that they did back in the 19th century or the 18th century. It's not, oh, let's do separation of powers again. I think even if we wanted to do that, there are some constraints. For example, insulation from partisan control is really tough to do right now, given the Supreme Court that we have. So we need to think creatively about how to sort of leverage the same general principles in a way that is suited for today's political economy. For example, some of the things I talk about, like corporate law and antitrust law, don't have like direct parallels, I think, back in the 19th century. It's thinking about how can we restructure the economy itself to make this harder, which I think is a bit of a novel innovation. I talk a lot about participatory governance in the paper, kind of bringing citizens into the policymaking process. You can see parallels of this historically. I mean, if you go back to ancient Athens, direct democracy, sortition is present there. You can see that in the citizen vetoes over public debt in the 19th century. It's a more limited way. It's just like you get a veto, you get to say no. But if we think a little more creatively about how to bring that in today, you can leverage those principles to a new context. And I think the principles are universal, though.
Okay, so let's complicate things a little further. And if you allow me, let's zoom out from your paper itself, and let's just talk about bigger picture things that are sort of happening. And so this is less of at least from my end, it's going to be less of an academic talk and more of a bar chatter. But, as a citizens, I worry a lot about several things, including that, as we all know, Supreme Court of the United States held in Trump v. United States that a president possesses absolute immunity for core constitutional acts and at least presumptive immunity for all other official acts. And the pardon power is itself a core official act, which means a president can shield allies who commit crimes on his behalf. So we now face a situation where the actor directing the corruption potentially is effectively outside the reach of criminal law and simultaneously possesses the power to extinguish the criminal liability of an entire network around the president. So that compounds both problems at the same time, right? The systematic corruption you describe because this disciplining threat of prosecution disappears, and the opportunistic corruption you set aside at the outset because the personal enrichment becomes much safer when prosecution is off the table. You talked about your reform agenda. Can we borrow from there to sort of try to correct something here, or is this impossible because of how the U.S. Supreme Court just laid the ground?
Yeah, so I think the president's ability to use pardons as a tool of systematic corruption, so to speak, is extremely troubling. There's been other work about this, about pardons as patronage, which I cite in the paper. And I think we ought to consider constitutional reforms to constrain it. Of course, it's very hard to amend the Constitution, so I'm not too optimistic on that front. What can we do short of amending the Constitution? Well, I think a lot of the reforms I consider in the paper and the ones I look back to from the 19th century are really about civil law. And I don't mean civil versus common law. I mean like the non-criminal areas of law. And actually, I don't think that individual criminal prosecutions, the sort that pardons shield people from, are really all that matter all that much in dismantling systematic corruption. So you can look back to Boss Tweed in the 19th century. Boss Tweed was the infamous political boss of Tammany Hall in New York City in the 1860s into the early 1870s. And he was both, he practiced both systematic and opportunistic corruption. So Tammany, both before and after him, used patronage, a form of systematic corruption, I would argue, to cement its hold on New York City, among other tools. And then Boss Tweed went much, much further in enriching himself personally through basically skimming money. You could call it embezzlement. These inflated contracts, in particular around this county courthouse, to the tune of the modern day equivalent, adjusted for inflation, of billions of dollars. And eventually, this brought him down. He was criminally prosecuted after much investigative reporting by the New York Times, some nasty political cartoons by this guy named Thomas Nast. But that didn't bring down Tammany. That did not stop the systematic corruption. Another boss replaced him, a guy referred to as Honest John. Honest because he didn't do too much opportunistic corruption. He didn't enrich himself personally, at least too much, but he continued to practice systematic corruption. And subsequent Tammany bosses went back to the opportunistic too. So Richard Croker was a boss in the early 20th century, and he did both too. And in fact, it got even more sordid, involving brothels and all sorts of things. But the point is, like, the individual prosecution isn't really going to stop the problem, because the problem is institutional. It's broader than that. And you can't just pick sort of like cut a few bad apples from the tree. You need to get at the roots. So yes, I find the use of pardons as patronage to be troubling, and it does help to facilitate systematic corruption insofar as criminal law is no longer a way to stop this kind of stuff. But we need to go deeper anyways. So what does that mean? I think that means really fundamental institutional reform of the sort that I propose in the paper. So I don't think all hope is lost here.
Okay, that's good. So now I want to bring in your other body of work because I think it reframes what we've been talking about in an important way, and in fact, it connects directly to what I explore in my book. So I refer to your article on political transformation of corporate America, which documents something striking, that the ideological center of gravity of American corporate elites has shifted to the left over the last 2 decades, and corporate elites as a whole moved from modestly conservative in 2001 to roughly centrist by 2022. But the picture varies considerably within that. Can you give us the highlights?
Yeah. So, probably the finding that gets cited most often is about the average. So, the average ideology of the corporate directors and executives that I'm able to match to donors has moved to the left considerably over time. It starts off sort of, modestly conservative and ends up around the ideological center of American politics. But within that average, it masks a lot of heterogeneity. What exactly you see varies by industry, varies by role. So thinking about industry variation, the energy industry, for example, has been and remains pretty dang conservative over the entire time series. They moved just a tiny bit to the left, but it's hardly noticeable. Whereas some other industries have seen pretty marked shifts. So the tech industry, for example, the average was closer to the center at the beginning of my sample period in 2001, but by 2022, they're leaning a fair amount to the left on average. Other industries are perhaps somewhere in the middle. Healthcare tends to be pretty far, not I wouldn't say far to the left, but more to the left today than it used to be, for example. And then there's a lot of variation by role. CEOs started off with a very strong conservative skew at the beginning of my sample period, and they continue to exhibit a conservative skew, although it's a much more modest conservative skew than it used to be. Back in 2001, it was very hard to find a liberal CEO as measured by their campaign contributions, but today there are quite a few of them, even if they are outnumbered by conservatives. For certain other roles, like senior managers, by which I mean executives below the C-suite level. These people now, I mean, back in the early start of my sample period, 2001, they were roughly balanced between liberals and conservatives, with maybe a little more conservatives than liberals. Today, there's a strong liberal skew among these folks. You can still find conservatives, you can find moderates too, but if you look at a density plot of the sort of ideological distribution, you would see a big hump on the left side of that distribution. And then for directors, they started off with a strong conservative skew back in 2001, and now they're roughly balanced between liberals and conservatives, with some moderates in there as well. So lots of heterogeneity by industry, by role. And then in the paper, I try to sort of put some data to the questions about why these changes have actually happened. Happy to get in that if you'd like, but that is a larger conversation.
Right. So let me try to pull you an abuse of my host privileges to get your take on something I cover in my book, and maybe we're going to explore that. So, as you know, I cite your work several points in the book because it helps explain a puzzle at the heart of corporate governing, which is why would firms take progressive positions on guns, on climate, on LGBTQ, in ways that invite political backlash. So part of the answer might be, and your data would seem to suggest, but you don't say that, to be clear, right? That would be a reading that they do that because of this ideological shift. And of course, there are other studies out there from financial economists that suggest that it might be actually just a strategic positioning. So we don't know, right? But it can be that there's well, under one theory is this managers moved in this direction and reflected that in the way they acted. But it can be also another way around, which is that firms are responding adaptively to market pressure, mainly from employees, but also maybe from consumers who are increasingly college educated and tend to champion causes that normally would be associated with the Democratic coalition, for lack of a better term, right? So let's think about a case that pops up a bunch of times at several phases. And Disney, more recently, right, when the FCC threatened ABC's broadcast license over Jimmy Kimmel, ABC pulled Jimmy Kimmel for a bit, and then there was huge backlash, right? And what maybe reversed the capitulation was pressure from several directions, right? Employees, consumers, public backlash. a bunch of people canceled their subscription. So when Disney reversed, was it a C-suite leading ideologically, or was it a firm simply reading the room? You're an empiricist, so maybe anecdotes are not your, you don't like them that much. And
Oh, yeah. Let's see
but I'm curious where you come out on this.
Yeah. So I suspect that firms are responding to pressure from multiple stakeholders, not just its leadership, not just directors and executives. Obviously, my paper is about the leadership, so that's what I focus on. But that's not to say that the other stakeholders don't matter at all. And I think you're right to wonder if the observed relationship between leadership ideology on the one hand and various corporate stances on socio-political issues like LGBTQ rights on the other could be picking up some of these other influences. It's surely true that leadership ideology is correlated with employee ideology. So there could be an omitted variable here. I try to address this in my work in a couple ways. First, I can tell you that leadership ideology remains a significant predictor of corporate stances on, let's say, LGBTQ rights, which is what I study in the APSR paper, even once you include employee ideology in the model. This finding is actually not in the paper itself because I did it after it was published, after some new data on employee sort of partisan leanings became available. But it holds even once you include employee ideology. In fact, employee ideology becomes insignificant in the most saturated version of the model when it's included alongside leadership ideology, which suggests that leadership ideology is really driving things more. Second, in the paper, I use an instrumental variables design to address concerns about selection, namely the fear that leaders are choosing which firms to work for based on how the firm itself is going to behave on these socio-political issues. So the way I address this, I use a leave one out estimator where I basically look at the ideology of other firms in the same industry as a kind of instrument for what that firm is doing, given that firms are constrained to hire other people in the same industry, generally speaking. And the results hold under this instrumental variables design. None of these empirical strategies are perfect, but I think they provide some good evidence that leadership ideology does in fact matter. And I can say I'm working on another project right now that looks at a different type of socio-political corporate stance as an outcome. And I find similar things there. So this is a new data set, finding the same sort of stuff. I think there's pretty good evidence that leadership ideology does matter, which is not to say it's the only thing that matters. I'm sure consumers matter too. I'm sure employees matter. I think the Disney anecdote is a very good reflection of this because the leadership at Disney, Bob Iger, Dana Walden, who was supposedly the one that made the initial decision about Kimmel, these are at least judging by their campaign donations, pretty liberal people. And in fact, both of them are in my data set. I looked them up. They're pretty liberal, according to their campaign contributions. And yet they made this decision initially to suspend Kimmel from the air. So how do you understand that? It must be a strategic calculation. And then they walked back. Why did they walk back? Well, because employees, customers, other stakeholders were making lots of noise about it. So I think it's pretty clear in this particular incident that they were very much responding to their stakeholders. So I think, the corporation is a nexus for all these different influences that can come together.
Right, and it's interesting. I think that where this leads is that the particular political era dictates a lot. So, most of the studies on this, including your studies, sort of end in 2022, and that was a particular political era, including Trump 1.0, where the presidency wasn't too popular, and so corporations were not shy to criticize it. Then things changed, and so it'll be interesting to test what is happening right now. But again, these are all very unstable equilibria, right? These things keep changing in the overall scheme of politics, and corporations keep reacting. There are some studies, and we have one of the authors of the study, Swarnadeep Homroy, who a few years ago came out with a paper, co-authored a paper where he found out that his CEOs who were making political statements were overwhelmingly leaning Republican, yet they were making lots of liberal-leaning statements as CEO. So it was the CEO himself or herself was making that statement, not just like the random C-suite or senior manager that was taking the initiative. And they were making this because, it was strategically paying off. But again, be curious to see how that study would look like if instead of cutting out his study, I believe is from 2014 to 2019, if the cutoff covers this time, because you were talking about the tech industry, right? And so our understanding of the tech industry is that, yes, both the employees and to some extent also senior managers, some CEOs were quite liberal. But then again, there was the famous reversal by Mark Zuckerberg, who showed up with the gold chain and said that, they were done with all things DEI. It's a very fascinating field to keep seeing what happens, because we're going to have several other types of observations and we can come up with a sort of a more multifaceted story, whether coherent or not, whether a unitary story, who knows?
Yeah. I'll add, my paper ends in 2022, but I've since then updated the data through 2024. And you might think, oh, we're going to see this big conservative backlash and corporate America is going to move back to the right. That's actually not what I observed the data as judged by their campaign contributions. If you estimate a kind of dynamic version of the ideology score that varies by cycle, you don't see a conservative retrenchment. You see the trend that was previously going to the left kind of level off, but you don't see people like snapping back to the right. And yet you see in the actual actions of the firms themselves a rightward shift. You see that in DEI. There's a major retreat on DEI, which you talk about in the book. I don't think that's because the ideological outlook of corporate America has changed. I think it's because they're reacting to external stimuli. So yes, ideology only takes you so far.
So these external stimuli is political pressure again. And so these sort of like, it's a perfect segue with what I wanted to ask you, which is let's set the corruption a frame aside for a moment, right? And think about the political economy straight on. So assume a perfectly law-abiding administration with loyal and restrained, ideologically restrained officials who don't want to manufacture political dependence, right? Here in the US and around the world, really, has changed. The reach of state action in the political economy has expanded dramatically. You were mentioning it before. You were talking about, FTC and DOJ antitrust approvals, but we have several other examples. You mentioned them in the paper, actually. So, U.S. Steel, Nippon Steel was eventually approved, but on terms that gave the U.S. government a golden share, which is a very European thing to do, but not really an American one. That's taking Intel with the CHIPS Act, conditioned billions in federal subsidies on domestic production commitments and placed a whole bunch of restrictions on the recipient's ability to expand manufacturing in some foreign countries. So, the government is a stakeholder with a bunch of strings attached, right? And of course, the ever expanding scope of CFIUS review, again, here in the US, everywhere else, I guarantee you, I studied the EU, I studied Italy. Deals who would have sailed through national security scrutiny a decade ago are now questioned, right? And the definition of a national security is covering a large wealth of industries, of course, including semiconductors, data, and AI infrastructure. So talking about AI, I mean, the US is positioning itself as a cheerleader and also a gatekeeper. So champions American AI dominance, but also pressures allied nations not to regulate it, and also restricts the export of advanced chips to rivals. So my question here is this expansion of state power in political economy a good thing or a bad thing, and for whom? I mean, because we have several angles here, the businesses or politicians or citizens. And of course, we may not care about politicians. We may have different views and mixed views on what is good for business, whether it's good for citizens, but definitely, we all care for our citizens. So what to make of this?
Yeah. So, all right, you invited me to set aside the corruption piece.
Bring it back in. That was my question.
I'll do it. I'll engage in your thought experiment, but not before not before I think that the corruption piece is really relevant. Because I'm most concerned about the expansion of state power, and you cited the Nippon Steel, U.S. Steel, which I talk about in the paper, insofar as it facilitates systematic corruption. So this golden share, right? What does the golden share do? Well, it provides additional levers for the president to get what he wants. What does he want? Well, one of those things is political loyalty, and that's, I think, demonstrably clear. I'm concerned about these discretionary levers that the government has now because they can be abused. I'm very much a Madisonian, and I believe that men are not angels, and our political institutions should be designed in a way that reflects that reality, which means we may want to limit state power in certain ways that we wouldn't necessarily want to do if men were indeed angels, or women, of course. But I'll gauge on your thought experiment, albeit on slightly different terms. I would say I won't assume that we have angels in government, but I'll assume that our political and legal institutions are structured in a way that does adequately safeguard against systematic corruption. In that case, would I be concerned about the expansion of state power over the political economy? And I think the answer is it would be case by case. So many of the examples you've mentioned boil down to industrial policy. So the CHIPS Act, for example, or we could talk about the Inflation Reduction Act and the subsidization of green energy, green industrial policy. Well, that could be desirable if it is used when markets are not working properly. So if you want to subsidize green energy because of the obvious negative externalities from climate change, from carbon emissions, and you think that other alternatives that economists like a carbon tax, are just totally politically dead letters, well, then green industrial policy is perhaps the way to go. On the other hand, in some contexts, it could be wasteful. The national security arguments for the CHIPS Act and stuff like that. I'm not a national security scholar, but they seem at least facially plausible to me, that we want to have domestic production because otherwise that makes us vulnerable to, I don't know, China invading Taiwan. Those seem like pretty good arguments to me. But I'm sure that a lot of what's going on is just protectionism by another name, without a very strong economic or political rationale. And that I find concerning, especially bringing it back to the corruption angle, insofar as protectionism and various exemptions from things can be a channel for systematic corruption. I think we've seen that with tariff exemptions under Trump. There's actually a study looking at requests for exemptions from tariffs in the first Trump administration, and finding that those exemptions were granted in a way that tracks the partisan donation patterns of corporate PACs. So it's hard to remove this corruption angle from the picture altogether, because I think it really does affect the answer to these questions.
Okay, so let's close with a last question. You end your corruption paper with a note of cautious optimism that systematic corruption is not an inevitable feature of democratic government. It is a design failure, and design failures can be fixed. Tools do exist, frameworks exist. And again, what's been missing was a good, clear-eyed account of the structural logic that connects these problems, and that is what your paper does so well. So let me end on that note of optimism and ask you something. If you were to advise someone, pick anyone you want to advise, a legislator, an activist, a student, a scholar deciding where to focus their energy, what is the single intervention in any of the areas that you analyze, the ones that you mentioned, that you think has the most realistic chance of making a dent in the next 5 to 10 years?
I guess if there's one thing, I would say, and given the constraints we have from our Supreme Court, given what is politically feasible, I think creating mechanisms for citizens to have greater input in our laws and policies is a promising direction to go in. I think there are a lot of empirical questions about what exactly is the best way to do this. There are trade-offs. If you empower citizens and push aside expert bureaucrats, you might lose out on some expertise. So we need to think carefully about how to do this, and maybe some empirical research could shed some light on this. But I think creating more mechanisms for the public to have a say would accomplish a variety of things. It would help mitigate systematic corruption, as I discussed in the paper. It would also help, I think, safeguard against sort of good old-fashioned regulatory capture, insofar as it would kind of balance out industry. And I think it would make people feel better about their government, which is not something to be ignored. Trust in government is at an all-time low right now, or at least for I don't want to say all time for all of millennia, but at least for a long time, it's at a low. And we need to do something to build up that trust in government, because that declining trust has all sorts of terrible consequences. So giving people more of a say in policy, even if they don't always make the right decision, I think is something that we should try to do. I think it's very popular with the public. There's a nice paper by Daniel Walters and Brian Feinstein that talks about the sort of public appetite for this. So I think we ought to consider that.
Reilly Steel, thank you so much for this great conversation. It was a pleasure to have you here. Thank you again.
Thank you, Matteo. It's been a great conversation. I've really enjoyed it.
So the papers we discussed today from Reilly, including systematic corruption, are linked in the show notes. And my book, Corporate Power and the Politics of Change, is published by Cambridge University Press. All other episodes in the series are available on the ECGI website and wherever you listen to podcasts, including YouTube. Thank you so much for listening.